The terms ethnic minority, racial minority, and even minority groups are used a lot around diversity and inclusion. Today, you're going to find out why the term minority is about to become dated. I'm Jonathan Ashong Lamptey, and this is the Resource Group's podcast, where every week I connect the dots in terms of best practices and practical research to help the people within your workplace reach their potential and drive performance through inclusive practices. I'm on a mission to give you the tools that you need to make a difference where you work. Get your pen and paper ready, because in today's show, I'm going to highlight why the generic use of the term minority needs to be revisited. Now, this is the first of a two-part series of shows that were inspired by a recent panel event that I attended. This show and the next one are inspired by questions raised by the audience that I thought could have been explored in a lot more detail on the night. As a regular listener of the show, you know how rare it is for me to attend panel events, but I was specifically invited by someone I really respected, and so I thought I'd go along. I was inspired by a comment from the audience that I'd heard before, in particular with regards to the term ethnic minority. And so I'm going to talk about three things that really matter, that are crucial for you to understand in terms of using this term now, and the circumstances that mean it's going to evolve into the future. So let's get to it. The first thing that really matters when talking about minority groups in this way is the context. Now let's be clear, I use the term minority in several ways that are convenient for me because I'm talking about particular groups in a particular context. Even though I'm talking about the workplace, I don't pretend that I'm talking about the global economy all of the time. I'm talking about the workplace in the West. And let's not forget, the vast majority of mainstream research about organizations, about the workplace, they make general claims about leadership, management, and everything else. And they act like it applies to everyone. And it really doesn't. They're talking about free market economies, they're talking about free labor markets, and they're talking about corporations that create value for their shareholders. But they pretend that this applies to everyone else, and once again, it really doesn't. So when you hear me talk about the workplace, when you hear me say minority groups, I'm talking about the very specific context of the West, where in most economies, people who are of African heritage, people who are of Asian heritage are in a minority. And this is why the context matters. Before we get to the second thing, I want to talk about the importance of sharing. If you hear anything that you find interesting, then please share it with one other person that you think would find it useful. If you're finding this for the first time, make sure you check out the show notes. You can access these wherever you're listening to the podcast. The show notes have got details of all the reports and all the resources that are mentioned in the show. I've put this together for you so that you can go deeper into anything that we discuss here. Now let's get back to talking about minority groups. The second thing that I want you to understand when talking about minority groups in this way is that power matters. Power is relevant when talking about minority and majority groups. I've interviewed people who are black, people who are Chinese, who said that they didn't consider themselves to be an ethnic minority because ethnic minorities are victims. They said this because there's a perception that belonging to a minority group implies weakness and lack. And this shows the importance of the words that we use and the meanings that are attached to those words. For the most part, the term minority is indicative of a lack of power, and it is indicative of a lack of authority. And also, to some extent, it does imply a lack of agency. Those in the minority often have to meet the expectations of the majority. In an election, the group that gets the majority of the votes wins. Well, it's certainly a version of that. A lot of Western norms around allocating resources are influenced by utilitarianism. Now, I'm not going to turn this into a philosophy lecture, but utilitarianism is an ethical theory that's often presented as an argument for maximizing the utility, the pleasure, the well-being of the largest group of people, the majority. Now, a really crude version of this is that the right thing to do is to maximize the benefits for the largest number of people, the majority. Now, this is an ethical standpoint that permeates our society, and it's often used to justify or excuse the oppression of minority groups. Now you know I'm making an oversimplified point here because I do want to make a point. But I don't want you to leave the show thinking that the power of the majority should be taken for granted. You don't have to look too far to see examples of a minority group that were able to wield power over a majority. Think of South Africa under apartheid or India under colonial rule. The point I want to make is that the term minority implies a lack of power, and this matters because it reflects the perceived lack of power that minority groups have in the Western workplace. The third and final thing that I want you to understand when talking about minority groups in this way is that the numbers matter. To explain this, I want to explore 2 points. The first is a Western lens. In the 20th century, it's easier to justify looking at everything through a Western lens, particularly if you are based in the West. Most of the research, economic trends, and entire world views were based on Western perspectives. However, a lens that places the West at the center of the universe is simply going to be less useful in the 21st century. A truly global view would therefore recognize that so-called minority groups, such as Africans and Asians, in a Western lens, are actually part of a majority group when viewed through a global lens. And this immediately points towards the relationship with power that I highlighted earlier. The second thing that I want to explore here is that even in a Western context, attempts to promote the free movement of labor mean that so-called minority groups are growing in numbers, particularly in cities in the West. For example, in London, 40.2% of residents identified as being Black, Asian, mixed, or an other ethnic group. This is taken from a report that's just a couple of months old, but the data is taken from a census from 2011. This means that the figures could be a lot higher now. These trends mean that we should really rethink the language we use and the reasons for doing so, particularly given the way the world is developing. Not only that, the required approach will be different all over the world, and it would be useful for you to think about how you choose your approach based on your personal circumstances. If you want to discuss this with your friends and colleagues, I've created a slide deck for you. It summarizes everything that we discussed here because we want to give you the tools that you need to make a difference where you work. It's free, and you can get this from the Resource Groups community on LinkedIn. So let's wrap this up. What are the key messages here? The 3 things that are crucial for you to understand regarding the term minority groups are: 1. The context in which these groups are found. 2. The power dynamics between majority and minority groups. And 3. The number of people in a context influences who is in the minority and who is in the majority. So what do you think? Are you in a so-called minority group? How do you feel about that? Get in touch or leave a message. I would love to hear from you. If you've learned something from today's show, you should sign up to our insider list. It's free, and you can stay ahead of the pack and get the best of everything that I produce. Thanks for listening, and I will see you in the next episode.